Most people think money solves problems, but what it actually does is change which problems your mind has to solve. Think about the last time money felt like a problem. Not an abstract financial concern, a real, immediate pressure. The kind that sits quietly in the back of your mind during unrelated conversations. The kind that changes how you sleep. That makes ordinary decisions feel heavier than they should. Most people remember that feeling clearly, and most people assume the solution is simple. Reach a certain number, and the feeling disappears. It doesn't work that way. Research on wealth and psychology reveals something most financial advice never mentions. Money doesn't just change your circumstances, it changes your mind. The way you perceive risk, the way you think about time, the problems that feel urgent, the comparisons that suddenly start to matter. Each shift in financial position doesn't simply remove the previous problem. It replaces it with an entirely different psychological landscape. There are 7 recognizable levels to this progression, and what makes them fascinating isn't the money involved. It's what happens to the mind at each stage, what it begins to want, what it begins to fear, and what it can no longer fully understand about the level it left behind. Most people think about wealth as a destination, a number, a threshold after which the financial pressure finally stops and something better begins. And there is truth in that, up to a point. Crossing certain financial thresholds does remove specific pressures. It does create space that didn't exist before. But what almost no one tells you is what happens to the mind when those thresholds are crossed. Because money doesn't just change your circumstances, it changes what your mind notices, what it fears, what it wants, and what it is even capable of imagining. This video is about that change, not about how to accumulate wealth, not about investments, and not about what the financially successful do differently. It's about something more fundamental. The predictable ways different levels of financial position reshape the psychology of the person inside them. There are 7 recognizable stages to this progression, and each one comes with its own cognitive environment, its own invisible assumptions, its own dominant fears, its own definition of what enough means. Understanding these levels doesn't tell you where to go, but it does something more useful. It tells you where you are. And once you can see the level you're operating from, clearly, honestly, without the story you've been telling yourself about it, your relationship to money, to status, and to the problems your mind keeps returning to begins to look different than it did before. Picture 2 people sitting at the same dinner table, same age, same background. But one of them recently crossed a financial threshold. Not wealthy by any dramatic measure, just stable. Bills are covered. There's a buffer. The quiet pressure that used to sit behind every purchase decision has, for the first time, gone silent. And yet something unexpected happens. Sitting across from someone who is still inside that pressure, they realize they can't quite access it anymore. Not the memory of it, but the weight of it. The texture of what it feels like when every decision carries survival stakes. It's still visible in the other person, but it no longer feels fully real. This is one of the least discussed effects of financial change. Not what money gives you, but what it quietly removes from your ability to understand. Each level of wealth doesn't just shift your circumstances, it shifts your reference point. And reference points, once moved, are extraordinarily difficult to move back. The person who has never worried about rent cannot fully simulate what that worry feels like. The person who has spent years inside that worry cannot fully imagine what it feels like to be free of it. The money didn't just change the bank account, it changed the operating system. Psychologists who study economic psychology describe this as psychological distance from scarcity, the degree to which financial pressure remains a life-felt experience versus something remembered from a previous life. And what the research consistently shows is that this distance isn't only emotional, it's cognitive. It changes what the mind notices, what it prioritizes, what kind of future it can realistically imagine. Which is why understanding the 7 levels isn't really about money at all. It's about understanding how the mind changes when its fundamental conditions change. The psychological study of wealth and cognition begins with a finding that took researchers by surprise. It wasn't that wealthy people were happier or that poor people were more stressed. Both of those outcomes were expected. What surprised researchers was something more precise. Financial position appeared to change the way the mind itself allocates attention. In 2013, researchers Sendil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir published work that reshaped how economists and psychologists understood poverty. Their central finding was simple but powerful. Scarcity doesn't just create financial pressure. It creates what they described as a cognitive tax. When the mind is consumed by immediate financial threat, it has measurably less bandwidth available for everything else. Long-term planning, impulse control, abstract reasoning. The mind under scarcity isn't less intelligent, it's less available. This insight established the foundation for understanding wealth as a psychological progression rather than simply a financial one. Each level of wealth doesn't just represent a different amount of money. It represents a different allocation of cognitive resources. At the lowest levels, the mind is almost entirely occupied by immediate survival, not by choice, but by the structural demands of scarcity. As financial pressure decreases, cognitive bandwidth is gradually released. And what the mind does with that freed bandwidth, what it starts to notice, want, and fear, changes systematically at each level. These differences are not personality traits. They are not virtues or flaws. They are predictable cognitive responses to changing conditions. The person at level 1 isn't thinking short-term because they lack discipline. They are thinking short-term because the mind, under sufficient scarcity, has no other option. This is where the pattern begins. The neurological mechanism behind this progression involves what researchers call attentional capture, the brain's tendency to prioritize information that appears most immediately relevant to survival. Under financial scarcity, anything related to money, cost, or resource allocation receives automatic priority in the brain's attentional system. Not because the person decided to focus there, but because the brain's threat detection system continuously redirects attention toward the most pressing source of uncertainty. This is the same system that makes it difficult to concentrate on anything else when you're in physical pain. Financial pressure produces a functionally similar effect. As wealth increases and immediate survival pressure decreases, the attentional system gradually releases its grip. The mind becomes available for longer time horizons. This is why the psychological shift between level 2 and level 3, from stability to comfort, often produces an unexpected experience. the sudden awareness of desires and preferences that were always present but never had space to be felt. People at this transition frequently report a strange discovery. For the first time, they begin asking what they actually want, not just what they need. The cognitive space that opens when survival is no longer the primary concern can feel like a new kind of consciousness. But the progression doesn't simply move toward freedom. Each level introduces its own form of cognitive capture. At level 4, the mind that has solved survival, stability, and comfort discovers a new preoccupation: status. The attentional system, no longer required to monitor financial threat, begins monitoring social position instead. Dopamine, the neurochemical associated with reward seeking, becomes increasingly responsive to signals of recognition, comparison, and relative standing. The problems change. The intensity of the mind's engagement with those problems does not. The 7 levels do not operate as a perfectly clean progression. People move between them, sometimes gradually, sometimes suddenly, and the psychological residue of previous levels does not disappear simply because the financial conditions change. Research on lottery winners and sudden wealth repeatedly shows something striking. When people experience rapid financial change, they often report a deep sense of disorientation. The external circumstances changed. The internal operating system did not. The mind continues running the cognitive patterns of the level it inhabited for years. Scarcity thinking can persist inside abundance. Status anxiety can remain even after security is achieved. These psychological patterns are far more durable than the money itself. There is also significant variation in where people become psychologically stuck. For many, level 4, the status level, becomes the trap. Psychologist Tim Kasser's research on materialism and well-being revealed something important. People who organize their lives primarily around money and status tend to report lower life satisfaction over time, not because wealth is harmful, but because the status level, when treated as a destination rather than a stage, becomes a loop without exit. The levels above status represent genuine psychological reorientations. At level 5, the primary currency shifts from money to time. The mind stops asking, "How much can I earn?" and begins asking, "What am I spending my hours on?" At level 7, the shift becomes even more profound. The self, which served as the reference point for every previous level, begins to recede. The question is no longer about the individual at all, which leads to the part most people never consider about wealth: what it actually feels like from the inside at each level. Think about how conversations about money change depending on the level someone is at. A person at level 1 talks about money in terms of this week: what's due, what's short, what can be delayed. A person at level 3 talks about money in terms of lifestyle: the upgrade they're considering, the vacation they're planning, the version of their life they're trying to build. A person at level 5 rarely talks about money at all. They talk about time, about what they're choosing to do with it, and what they're choosing to stop doing. The subject didn't change. The psychological relationship to it did. This shift is visible in smaller moments too. The person who finally reaches level 2, stability, often expects relief. But what many experience instead is a different form of tension. The scarcity mindset doesn't disappear with the first financial buffer. It recalibrates. Now, there is something to protect, and the mind that spent years in survival mode doesn't easily transition into trust. Protective patterns remain active long after the original threat has passed. This is why financial education alone rarely changes financial behavior. The behavior was never primarily about knowledge. It was about the cognitive environment the mind learned to operate in. And then there is the visibility gap between levels. Each level quietly reshapes what a person can see clearly and what becomes difficult to imagine. The person at level 4, surrounded by status competition, can recognize level 1 abstractly, but they can no longer fully feel it as a lived reality. The person at level 6, observing the anxiety of level 4 from outside the comparison game, can see the pattern clearly, but they remember what it felt like to be inside it, when the loop was invisible. Each level becomes, in a sense, a closed perceptual world, complete from the inside, partially invisible from anywhere else, which raises a question that changes how this entire progression is usually understood. The first shift that understanding this progression produces is perceptual. Once you recognize that each level comes with its own cognitive environment, its own set of invisible assumptions about what matters, what's threatening, and what's even possible, you stop interpreting the behavior of people at different levels as personality. The person who seems unable to think long-term isn't undisciplined. They're operating under a cognitive tax that makes long-term thinking structurally difficult. The person who can't stop competing for status isn't shallow. They're running a reward system that redirected from survival to recognition without their conscious participation. The level explains the behavior, and that realization changes how judgment works, both toward others and toward yourself. The second shift involves recognizing where you actually are, not where you believe you should be, or where you present yourself as being, but where your mind is genuinely operating. Most people significantly misidentify their own level, not because they're dishonest, but because the cognitive environment of each level feels like reality, not like a stage. The person at level 4 doesn't experience status competition as a phase they're passing through. They experience it as the natural and obvious way the world works. Identifying your actual level requires asking a specific question. What problems is my mind spending the most time solving right now? Not what problems you think you should be solving. What problems actually occupy your attention? The answer locates you more accurately than any financial number. The third shift, and the one that requires the most sustained attention, is recognizing that moving between levels isn't automatic. Money can change your circumstances overnight, but it almost never changes your mind at the same speed. People who experience sudden wealth without the corresponding psychological transition often find themselves financially at level 5, while cognitively still operating at level 2 or 3. The external conditions changed. The internal reference point didn't. This is why the most durable transitions between levels involve not just financial change, but deliberate exposure to the thinking patterns of the next level, the questions it asks, the problems it prioritizes, the relationship to time and status that defines it. The mind moves when it has a new cognitive environment to move into, not before. There is something quietly disorienting about seeing the level clearly for the first time, because it means recognizing that the problems you're currently consumed by, the comparisons, the anxieties, the definitions of enough that feel so obviously correct, are not universal truths. They are the specific psychological output of the level you're in. The person at level 1 cannot imagine the problems of level 6. The person at level 6 can barely remember what it felt like to be at level 1. And somewhere in that gap is something important. The realization that your current relationship to money is not the final version of how you'll see it. Every level feels complete from the inside. Every level has its own logic, its own version of what matters, its own invisible ceiling above which imagination struggles to reach. And every level, from a sufficient distance, reveals itself as a stage, not a destination. The survival anxiety of level 1 is real. The status competition of level 4 is real. The legacy questions of level 7 are real. What changes is not the intensity of the experience. What changes is what the mind decides is worth that intensity. Wealth doesn't just change what you can buy. It changes the problems your mind considers worth solving. And once you see that clearly, once you can locate yourself in the progression with some honesty, something shifts. Not necessarily toward the next level, but toward a clearer understanding of why the mind is doing what it's doing. And that understanding, quietly, changes the relationship to all of it. The 7 levels were never really about money. They were about the mind that money shapes, about the problems that feel urgent at each stage, the comparisons that feel threatening, the definitions of enough that feel obvious, until the level changes and suddenly they don't. You are somewhere in this progression right now. The level you're at isn't a judgment. It isn't a measure of your worth, your intelligence, or your potential. It's a description of the cognitive environment you're currently operating in. And like every environment, it has walls you can't fully see from the inside, and a door that only becomes visible once you understand what you're looking for. The most important question isn't which level you want to reach. It's this: what problems is your mind spending the most time solving right now? Because that's where you actually are. And knowing where you are, clearly, honestly, is always the beginning of being able to move. If this changed how you think about your relationship to money and wealth, tell me in the comments. To continue this understanding, watch the next video here, and to understand human behavior at a deeper level, subscribe to Decoded Way.